Imagine a single grain of silica, worn perfectly smooth by 10,000 years of restless movement, tumbling over the crest of a dune that stretches toward an infinite horizon. This tiny fragment of quartz is one of trillions, a microscopic witness to a silence so profound it seems to have existed since the dawn of time. To stand in the heart of the Sahara today is to stand in a world defined by absence. There is no sound here but the low, mournful whistle of the wind as it braids the sand into intricate patterns, and no scent but the dry, metallic tang of sun-baked dust. The heat is not merely a temperature but a physical weight, a shimmering veil that distorts the distance into a series of liquid illusions. We call this a wasteland, a void, a place where life has been scoured away by the relentless passage of the sun. Yet if we were to peel back the layers of these golden drifts, if we were to look beneath the stratigraphy, that is, the vertical layers of Earth that act as a diary of our planet's past, we would find a story that contradicts everything our eyes tell us. Beneath the parched skin of the modern desert lies the ghost of a garden. There was a time when this landscape did not crackle with heat, but instead hummed with the sound of falling rain and the rustle of tall emerald grasses. This is the paradox of the Green Sahara, a period known to geologists as the African Humid period. It was a span of roughly 10,000 years when the largest hot desert on Earth was a sprawling tapestry of sapphire lakes and winding river systems. It is difficult for the modern mind to reconcile the image of a camel trekking across a waterless expanse with the reality of what once was, a world where hippopotamuses wallowed in deep pools and crocodiles basked on muddy banks in the very center of what is now a sea of sand. As you settle into your blankets and let the weight of the day drift away, perhaps you can imagine the air growing cooler and the scent of damp earth rising from the ground. You are listening to the Slumber Archives, and if you are finding comfort in these echoes of the deep past, I invite you to join us every day as we explore a new chapter of forgotten history. Subscribing ensures that we can meet here every night, and a gentle like on this video helps our community grow, allowing others to find a peaceful refuge in these stories. Now, let us turn our gaze back to the shifting sands. The transition from that lush, verdant paradise to the sterile beauty we see today was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow, rhythmic breathing of the earth. Scientists look to the younger Dryas, a brief, sharp return to glacial conditions nearly 13,000 years ago, as the catalyst for a massive shift in global weather patterns. As the northern ice sheets retreated, the monsoons of Africa shifted their path, marching northward to drench the Sahara in life-giving water. For thousands of years, the desert vanished. In its place, a network of paleolakes formed, some of them as vast as the Caspian Sea. One such body of water, known to researchers as Lake Mega Chad, covered over 135,000 square miles. To put that into perspective, it was larger than all of the Great Lakes of North America combined. Today, only a small, shallow remnant remains, a tiny blue eye staring up at the sun from a face of cracked clay. The evidence of this lost world is not buried deep within the earth, but often sits right on the surface, waiting for a keen eye to spot it. Explorers frequently stumble upon the calcified remains of ancient catfish, some as long as a grown man, resting in the middle of a valley where no rain has fallen in living memory. There are mounds of discarded shells from freshwater mollusks, piled high like kitchen middens, marking the spots where ancient families once gathered for a feast by the water's edge. But perhaps the most haunting evidence of all is found in the high, rocky plateaus of the Gilf Kebir. Here, tucked away in a shallow overhang of sandstone, is a place known as the Cave of Swimmers. Discovered in the year 1933 by the Hungarian explorer Laszlo Almásy, the cave contains rock art that seems to defy the very laws of the landscape. Across the walls, small red-painted figures are depicted in motion. their limbs outstretched, their bodies horizontal, frozen in the unmistakable posture of people gliding through water. To see these swimmers in the middle of a plateau where the nearest permanent well is hundreds of miles away is to experience a profound sense of vertigo. It forces us to confront the limits of our own perspective. We view the desert as eternal, yet in the grand scale of deep time the sand is merely a temporary visitor. The paintings are estimated to be between 6,000 and 9,000 years old, created by a culture that saw the Sahara not as a barrier, but as a cradle. These ancient artists did not just paint what they saw, they painted the rhythm of their lives. Alongside the swimmers are depictions of giraffes, elephants, and ostriches, creatures that require vast amounts of vegetation and water to survive. The detail is exquisite, capturing the curve of a long neck or the powerful stride of a hunter. It suggests a deep intimacy with the natural world, a connection that was severed when the rains finally began to fail. As the centuries passed, the tilt of the Earth's axis underwent a subtle change, a phenomenon known as precession. This wobble in the planet's spin slowly nudged the monsoon rains back toward the equator. Year by year, the lakes began to shrink. The lush savanna turned to scrubland, and the scrubland turned to dust. The great river systems, which once flowed from the heart of the continent to the Mediterranean, were choked by encroaching dunes, leaving behind only ghost rivers that can still be seen today through satellite radar imaging, buried beneath meters of sand. Imagine the quiet desperation of the people who lived through this transformation. They would have watched as the horizons grew hazy with dust and the green fringes of their world retreated toward the few remaining oases. They were forced to migrate, following the shrinking water toward the Nile Valley to the east and the Niger River to the south. It is quite possible that the very foundations of the great Egyptian civilization were laid by these climate refugees, carrying with them the memories of a green world that was fast becoming a myth. The modern Sahara is a graveyard of these memories. When the wind blows with enough ferocity, it uncovers more than just bones and shells. It reveals the stone tools of the Green Saharans, finely napped arrowheads and heavy grinding stones used to process wild grains. These artifacts sit atop the dunes, polished by the wind, appearing exactly as they were left thousands of years ago, as if the owners had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. There is a certain peace in realizing how much of our history is hidden from us, protected by the very environment that seems so hostile. The desert does not destroy, it preserves. It holds the secrets of the Green Sahara in a dry, silent embrace, waiting for the cycle to turn once more. For geologists know that this is not the first time the Sahara has been green, and it will not be the last. In another 10 or 15,000 years, the earth will wobble back, the rains will return, and the seeds currently sleeping deep beneath the sand will wake up to find a world transformed once again. As we drift further into the past, let the image of the shifting sands fade into the background. Replace the golden heat with the cool blue depths of an ancient lake. Hear the soft lap of water against a reed boat and the distant call of a crane. The world before the sand was a world of movement, of life, and of a deep, resonant connection to the land. It reminds us that nothing is permanent, that even the most vast and formidable landscapes are subject to the slow, patient tides of time. We are merely travelers, passing through a brief window of history, looking out at a horizon that has seen empires rise and fall, and forests turn to dust. But for now, in the stillness of the night, we can simply rest in the knowledge that the desert is guarding its stories well, and that beneath the silence of the dunes, the spirit of the Green Sahara lives on, waiting for the rain. To understand how a garden can grow from a wasteland, we must first look upward, far beyond the clouds, to the slow and silent mechanics of the cosmos. The earth does not simply spin like a perfect, static marble in the dark. It breathes, it tilts, and it wobbles with a rhythm that spans tens of thousands of years. This subtle movement, known to astronomers as orbital precession, is the great conductor of the African humid period. It is a celestial engine, a slow-motion dance between our planet and the sun that dictates where the rain falls and where the dust settles. Every 26,000 years, the Earth completes a single graceful wobble on its axis, changing its orientation toward the stars. 10,000 years ago, this cosmic alignment reached a tipping point. The North Pole began to lean more deeply toward the sun during the summer months, increasing the solar energy, hitting the northern hemisphere by about 7%. It seems like a small fraction, a mere flicker in the vast energy exchange of our solar system. But on the surface of our world, it was enough to rewrite the laws of the land. This extra warmth acted as a catalyst, heating the vast land mass of North Africa more intensely than the surrounding oceans. As the hot air rose off the heated rocks and sands, it created a massive low-pressure vacuum, a silent call that reached out across the Atlantic. In response, the moist, heavy air of the ocean began to move inland, drawn by the heat, pulling the great African monsoon system hundreds of miles further north than its current boundaries. And so, the rains arrived. They did not come as a sudden, violent flood, but as a gradual shift in the character of the seasons. At first, the storms might have only reached the southern fringes of the desert, dampening the parched earth for a few weeks longer than usual. But as the centuries rolled by, the wet season lingered. The clouds began to crest over the high volcanic peaks of the Ahaga and the Tibesti Mountains, those dark, jagged sentinels that today stand surrounded by nothing but sand. Back then, they were the first to catch the moisture, their high altitudes wringing the water from the sky and sending it cascading down their slopes in silver ribbons. The transformation of the soil was a slow and patient alchemy. For millennia, the Sahara had been a place of mechanical weathering, where the wind ground rocks into fine, sterile dust. But water changes everything. As the rains became consistent, the chemical life of the earth began to stir. The moisture reacted with the minerals in the dust, breaking them down into the nutrients required for life. Seeds that had perhaps lain dormant in the deep cracks of the earth for generations, or were carried on the wings of birds travelling from the south, found a hospitable bed. Small patches of hardy grasses appeared first, their roots reaching down to anchor the shifting sands, creating a stable foundation for what was to come. As the years passed, the cycle of life and decay began to build upon itself. Each season's growth died back and left behind organic matter, mixing with the mineral dust to create the first true soil this region had seen in an age. This is the process of pedogenesis, the birth of earth from stone. It is a quiet miracle that we often take for granted, but in the context of the Green Sahara, it was the fundamental requirement for a civilization. The once yellow horizon began to take on a hue of dusty green, then a deep, vibrant emerald. The valleys, or wadis, which had been dry for 50,000 years, began to hum with the sound of running water. These were not merely seasonal streams, but permanent rivers that carved their way through the limestone and sandstone, eventually feeding into massive, shimmering lakes. One of these bodies of water, which researchers call Lake Megachad, grew to be larger than the Caspian Sea, a freshwater inland ocean that dominated the interior of the continent. Imagine standing on its shores and looking out at a horizon where the water meets the sky, with waves lapping against beaches that are now nothing but dunes. The air would have been heavy with the scent of damp earth and blooming acacia. The oppressive, dry heat of the desert was replaced by a humid, tropical warmth, tempered by the constant presence of water. This shift in the climate occurred at the end of what geologists call the Younger Dryas, a period of sudden cooling that had briefly returned the world to glacial conditions. When the warming finally resumed, it did so with a speed that is difficult for us to fathom. Within a few centuries, a geological heartbeat, the landscape was unrecognizable. The wobble of the Earth had effectively shifted the atmospheric gears of the planet, turning the largest desert on Earth into a corridor of life. Meanwhile, the animals began to move. Driven by instinct and the promise of new pastures, the great megafauna of Africa began their long march northward. Elephants, with their deep ancestral memories of waterholes, led the way. They were followed by giraffes, who browsed on the crown of the expanding forests, and hippopotamuses, who found sanctuary in the deep, permanent rivers. We know they were there not just because of the fossils we find buried in the sand, but because of the art left behind by the people who followed them. In the heart of the desert, on rocks that are now blistered by the sun, there are engravings of crocodiles and swimming figures, remnants of a time when the Sahara was a land of water. As we consider these vast stretches of time, we are reminded of the limits of our own perspective. We see the desert as a permanent fixture, a timeless void, but the celestial engine tells a different story. It tells us that the earth is a restless, changing thing, and that the stability we feel beneath our feet is only a temporary arrangement of the stars. The Green Sahara was not a fluke or a miracle. It was a predictable result of the Earth's orientation in space. It has happened before, and if the cycles of precession continue as they have for billions of years, it will happen again. But for the humans living 10,000 years ago, this was not a matter of planetary mechanics. It was simply the world as it was, a lush, bountiful gift. They moved into this new Eden with a sense of wonder, following the rivers into the heart of a territory that their ancestors had shunned for 1,000 generations. They found a world of interconnected lakes and high, cool plateaus, a place where the struggle for survival was softened by the abundance of the land. They began to settle, to build, and to observe the world around them, unaware that the very tilt of the planet that had given them this paradise would eventually, inevitably, take it away. As the moonlight reflects off the dunes tonight, it is strange to think that the same moon was once mirrored in the still waters of a Saharan lake. The silence of the desert is not the silence of an empty place, but the silence of a theatre after the play has ended and the lights have been dimmed. The stage is still there, the props are buried beneath the floorboards, and the script is written in the layers of the earth, the stratigraphy of forgotten ages. We are only now beginning to learn how to read that script, to understand how the arrival of consistent rains could turn a wasteland into a cradle of culture. The transition from dust to fertile soil was the first step in a journey that would lead to the creation of some of the most enigmatic art and society in human history. It was a time of transition, a bridge between the Ice Age and the world we know today. And as the celestial engine continued its slow, indifferent grind, the people of the Green Sahara lived out their lives in the shadow of the mountains, fishing in the lakes and hunting in the forests, perfectly in tune with a climate that seemed as though it would last forever. They could not know that the wobble was already continuing, that the tilt was already beginning to shift back, and that the moisture would one day retreat, leaving only the memory of the water and the stones they had carved. For now, however, the rain continues to fall in our minds, and the Sahara remains a deep, quiet green, resting under the watchful gaze of the shifting stars. Imagine, if you will, the sound of a single drop of water hitting a leaf, then another and another, until the rhythmic patter becomes a steady hum that drowns out the ancient silence of the dust. For thousands of years, the only voice the interior of Africa knew was the dry, abrasive whistle of the wind carving patterns into the rock. But as the earth tilted on its celestial axis, a new sound began to dominate the landscape, the deep, resonant thrum of falling water. This was not merely a seasonal rain or a passing storm, but a fundamental shift in the world's breathing. As the monsoons pushed further north, the parched basins of the central Sahara began to fill, not with sand, but with life. The geography of this lost world was defined by a scale that modern maps struggle to convey. At the heart of this verdant expanse, where today only the most resilient travellers dare to tread, there once sat a body of water so vast it defies the imagination. We call it Mega Lake Chad. To stand on its shores 10,000 years ago would have felt like standing at the edge of the world's end. It was a freshwater sea, stretching across more than 135,000 square miles. To put that into perspective, it was significantly larger than the Caspian Sea is today. A shimmering, turquoise expanse that mirrored the clouds and cooled the air for hundreds of miles in every direction. The weight of this water was so immense that it physically altered the land, pressing down upon the earth's crust. This was a time of liquid abundance. Where we now see the scorched depressions of the Bodel, there was once a world of deep, cool currents and white-capped waves. The stratigraphy, that is, the layers of soil and sediment that act as the Earth's diary, tells a story of a lake that rose and fell with the slow rhythm of the millennia. In these layers, researchers find the microscopic remains of diatoms, tiny silica-shelled organisms that only thrive in deep, healthy waters. They are the silent witnesses to a depth that reached over 500 feet in places, a drowned kingdom hidden beneath the modern dunes. And so, this great lake did not sit in isolation. It was the beating heart of a circulatory system that spanned the continent. As the rains continued to fall, the basins overflowed, and the water began to find its way across the plains, carving out a network of interconnected river systems that would seem impossible to a modern observer. There were rivers that once flowed from the volcanic peaks of the Tibesti Mountains, rushing down through canyons that are now choked with silt. These were not mere streams, but powerful arteries of life that carried the cool runoff of the highlands toward the great central sea. Meanwhile, further to the west, another giant was stirring. The Niger River did not always follow the path we know today. In this humid period, its tributaries reached out like silver fingers across the interior, creating a labyrinth of waterways that linked the deep interior to the distant coastlines. There is a quiet mystery in the way these waters moved, a slow, deliberate flooding of the world. As the years passed, the landscape transformed into a tapestry of vast wetlands and marshes. Imagine a horizon of tall, golden reeds swaying in a humid breeze, where the air is thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming lilies. These wetlands were the great nurseries of the Sahara. They were places of profound stillness, where the water moved so slowly it appeared to be at rest. Beneath the surface of these marshes, a complex world flourished. Massive Nile perch, some weighing hundreds of pounds, glided through the submerged forests of vegetation, while hippopotamuses wallowed in the shallows, their low bellows echoing across the water. It was a world of soft edges, where the line between the land and the water was blurred by miles of emerald moss and floating ferns. The harsh, jagged lines of the desert had been softened by the touch of the rain, replaced by the gentle curves of the riverbank and the undulating surface of the swamp. Radiocarbon dating, the process of measuring the decay of carbon atoms to determine the age of organic remains, reveals that this period of watery abundance lasted for thousands of years. It was a stable, enduring reality for the generations of humans and animals who lived there. They did not see the Green Sahara as a temporary miracle. To them, it was simply the way the world was. They lived in a world where the sound of water was the constant backdrop to their lives. The dry, biting sting of the sandstorm was a forgotten memory, replaced by the cooling mist of a waterfall or the gentle lap of waves against a dugout canoe. As we look back through the fog of deep time, we must wonder what it felt like to navigate this aquatic highway. One could have travelled by water for hundreds of miles, passing from a great lake into a winding river, through a vast marsh teeming with birds, and into yet another inland sea. The Sahara was not a barrier, but a bridge. It was a world of connectivity, where the movement of people and ideas followed the flow of the current. The sheer scale of these water systems suggests a climate of such consistent moisture that it challenges our modern understanding of meteorology. How could a place so dry today have once been the wettest region on the continent? The answer lies in the delicate balance of the Earth's orbit, but the physical evidence remains etched into the stone and sand. Even today, satellite imagery reveals the paleo-channels, the ghost rivers that still lie buried beneath the Sahara's surface. They are like the veins of a dry leaf, tracing the paths where mighty rivers once ran. When the wind blows just right, or when rare modern rains fall, these ancient beds sometimes reappear, a fleeting glimpse of the world as it used to be. The transition from the dry, younger Dryas, a period of sudden, intense cold and aridity that occurred roughly 12,000 years ago, to this humid paradise was a rebirth of the land. It was as if the earth had taken a long, deep breath and held it. The dust settled, the seeds that had lain dormant for centuries began to sprout, and the first trickles of water began to pool in the low places. Slowly the trickles became streams, and the streams became rivers, and the rivers became the great mega-lake Chad. In this world before sand, the very concept of a desert would have been alien. To the people carving images of swimmers into the rocks of the Gilf Kabir, water was the primary element of their existence. It was their source of food, their mode of travel, and their sacred boundary. They watched the sun set over horizons of water, the orange light reflecting off a surface that seemed to go on forever. They lived in the age of the great African lakes, a time when the heart of the continent was a mirror to the sky, and the sound of the wind was finally, blissfully, replaced by the song of the water. Beneath the surface of this shimmering, watery expanse, a slow and silent conquest was taking place. It began with the arrival of the acacia, those resilient, flat-topped sentinels of the African wilderness, which started their long march northward from the humid tropics. They did not move with haste, but with the patient persistence of life reclaiming its rightful home. Their seeds, carried in the bellies of migrating birds or swept along by the rising rivers, found purchase in the newly moistened earth of the central Sahara. As the rains grew more consistent, these hardy pioneers were joined by a sea of tall waving grasses, the kind of lush emerald carpet that we today associate only with the distant plains of the Serengeti. Imagine standing atop one of the high plateaus of the Gilf Kabir 10,000 years ago, looking out over a horizon that held no trace of gold or ochre. Instead, the world is a tapestry of infinite greens. The wind, which once carried only the sharp sting of grit, now moves through the long grass with a sound like the rushing of a distant tide. The air is heavy with the scent of damp earth and the sweet, honeyed fragrance of acacia blossoms. In this lost epoch, the Sahara was not a barrier, but a bridge, a vast contiguous garden where a traveller could walk for weeks under the dappled shade of a woodland canopy. As the vegetation thickened, the very climate began to transform in response to the life it supported. This is a phenomenon that modern climate scientists call a feedback loop, where the land and the atmosphere enter into a private conversation. The dense forest and the endless grasslands acted as a natural cooling system for the continent. Instead of the sun's heat striking bare rock and reflecting back into the air with a searing intensity, The green canopy absorbed the light, using it to fuel the slow, rhythmic pulse of photosynthesis. The plants breathed out moisture through their leaves, a process known as transpiration, which seeded the clouds above and invited even more rain to fall. The desert was not merely hiding, it had been effectively erased by a living, breathing machine of wood and leaf. Deep beneath this vibrant surface, the roots were performing a work of quiet engineering that would last for millennia. In the age of sand, the earth is flighty and restless, shifting with every gust of wind, but in the Green Sahara, the soil was anchored. The deep, twisting root systems of the acacia and the matted fibers of the perennial grasses wove themselves into the earth, creating a subterranean net that held the world in place. This stabilization allowed for the development of a rich, dark humus, a layer of organic history that stored the carbon of 1,000 seasons. This was the foundation upon which an entire civilization of plants and animals was built, a stable stage for the drama of the Holocene to unfold. As the years passed, the landscape became a labyrinth of life. The woodlands were not uniform. They were broken by clearings where the grass grew chest-high, hiding the movements of predators and prey alike. In the valleys, the acacias grew so thick that the sunlight only reached the ground in shimmering coins of light. One could walk for miles and never feel the full heat of the sun, protected by a ceiling of thorns and delicate feathery leaves. It was a world of soft edges and blurred boundaries, where the water met the grass and the grass met the trees in a seamless, emerald flow. We often think of the desert as an eternal thing, a fundamental feature of our planet's geography. But the stratigraphy, the study of the layers of the earth, tells a different story. When archaeologists dig deep into the Saharan floor, beneath the dunes that seem as old as time, they find the silent witnesses of this green age. They find the fossilized pollen of plants that cannot survive in the heat. They find the charred remains of ancient campfires fueled by wood that hasn't grown here for 6,000 years. And they find the microscopic traces of a soil that was once as fertile as any river delta. The transition from the dry, frozen world of the younger dryas, that final, bitter, cold snap of the last ice age, to this lush Savannah was a miracle of timing and planetary mechanics. The Earth's tilt had shifted just enough to pull the monsoons further north, and the continent responded with an explosion of vitality. It is a reminder of how thin the veil is between one world and the next. The Sahara we know is merely a mask, worn by a landscape that remembers a much more vibrant identity. In this world before sand, the silence of the desert was replaced by a symphony of sound, the rustle of the wind in the acacia branches, the low hum of insects in the heat of the afternoon, and the distant, rhythmic thrum of life moving through the undergrowth. It was a place of abundance, where the struggle for survival was tempered by the sheer wealth of the land. The people who lived here, the artists who would eventually paint the cave of swimmers, did not look out at a wasteland. They looked out at a paradise that seemed as though it would last forever, a world where the green was infinite and the water was always within reach. Imagine, for a moment, the sound of a heavy, rhythmic thudding vibrating through the soles of your feet, a deep, subsonic resonance that carries across miles of open savanna. It is not the sound of thunder, nor the shift of tectonic plates, but the collective footfall of a titan. In the modern era, we think of the great African elephant as a creature of the sub-Saharan plains or the dense jungles of the Congo. Yet 10,000 years ago, these grey giants were the master navigators of a northern world. They moved in vast, slow-moving processions, their tusks gleaming against a backdrop of emerald hills and silver lakes, travelling thousands of miles into the heart of what is now the most inhospitable desert on earth. As the monsoon rains shifted north during the early Holocene, they created a series of green corridors, lush ribbons of vegetation that acted as ancient highways for the megafauna. These were not merely seasonal migrations, but a fundamental expansion of life. Following the scent of water and the promise of acacia, the elephants moved alongside towering giraffes, whose long necks allowed them to graze from the canopies of trees that have long since turned to dust. To stand in the Gilf Kebir today is to stand in a silence so profound it feels heavy, but in that distant epoch the air was thick with the sounds of a thriving ecosystem, the trumpeting of calves, the snapping of branches, and the low, guttural rumbles of communication that defined the social lives of these nomadic herds. Deep in the basins of the Sahara, where the sand now ripples like a motionless ocean, there were permanent river systems and massive paleolakes, some of which rivaled the Great Lakes of North America in their scale. In these deep, cool waters, the hippopotamus found a sanctuary. It is a strange and beautiful image to contemplate. The heavy, rounded backs of hippos breaking the surface of a lake in the middle of the Libyan desert, their territorial bellows echoing off the sandstone cliffs. These creatures require deep water to protect their sensitive skin from the sun, and their presence in the fossil record of the Central Sahara is a silent, undeniable witness to a world of profound moisture and stability. Where there is water and abundant prey, the predators inevitably follow, maintaining a delicate and ancient balance. Along the banks of these vanished rivers, crocodiles drifted like submerged logs, patient, prehistoric watchers that have remained unchanged for millions of years. These were not the stunted, isolated desert crocodiles found today in a few remote Mauritanian oases, but massive Nile crocodiles thriving in a network of waterways that linked the heart of the continent to the Mediterranean coast. They shared these green corridors with lions and leopards who prowled the high grasses of the plateaus, their movements dictated by the shifting patterns of the herds. The landscape was a tapestry of life and death, woven together by the necessity of the hunt and the bounty of the rains. The sheer scale of this migration suggests a world of interconnectedness that is difficult for us to map today. We often view the past through the lens of modern geography, seeing the Sahara as a barrier, a void that separates the north from the south. But for the giants of the Green Sahara, the desert did not exist. There was only the horizon, an endless stretch of grazing land, dotted with clusters of trees and broken by the shimmering blue of inland seas. The elephants and giraffes were the architects of this land, their heavy paths trampling trails that other species would follow, their dung fertilizing the soil and spreading the seeds of the very forests they consumed. In places like the Gilf Kebir, a massive plateau in the southwest of modern Egypt, the evidence of this vibrant past is etched into the very stone. The rock art found here does not just depict people, it serves as a census of a lost world. We see the long, elegant lines of giraffes, their patterns rendered with careful observation by artists who must have spent hours watching them move through the scrubland. We see the unmistakable silhouette of the elephant, a creature of such power and intelligence that it clearly commanded the respect and awe of the human inhabitants. These were not mythical beasts to the people of the Cave of Swimmers. They were neighbors, competitors, and perhaps even spiritual guides. As the years passed and the centuries rolled into millennia, this balance was maintained by the steady pulse of the African Humid period. It was a time of ecological wealth that allowed for a slow, unhurried pace of life. The predator and the prey moved in a dance that had no beginning and no end, governed by the availability of water. This was the world before the sand, a world where the great sand sea was a great sea of grass, and where the only thing shifting beneath the feet of the giants was the rich, damp earth of a continent in bloom. Yet beneath this abundance lay a fragility that the inhabitants could not have perceived. The very existence of this green world was dependent on a subtle tilt in the Earth's axis, a slow wobbling known as precession that dictates where the sun's energy falls and where the monsoons choose to travel. For 10,000 years, the tilt was perfect, drawing the rains deep into the interior of Africa. But the cycles of deep time are indifferent to the empires of animals or men. Even as the elephants raised their trunks to the scent of the coming rain, the celestial gears were turning, and the corridors that had brought the giants north were beginning, very slowly, to narrow. There is a certain melancholy in imagining the last of the Saharan giraffes standing on a thinning patch of green as the lakes began to recede into the earth. It was not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual thinning of the veil. A century where the rains came a week late, then a month late, then not at all. The permanent river basins, once home to the crocodile and the hippo, began to fragment into isolated pools. The great migrations, once thousands of miles long, became shorter and more desperate as the animals searched for the water that had always been there. The transition from a world of giants to a world of dust is one of the most profound shifts in our planet's recent history. It reminds us that the landscapes we inhabit are not permanent, but are merely snapshots in a much longer, much more fluid story. The Gilf Kebir remains, its ancient rock still holding the heat of the sun, but the sounds of the giants have been replaced by the whistling of the wind. The migration of the giants was a golden age, a period when the heart of Africa breathed with a fullness that seems almost like a dream to those of us who look upon the desert today. And yet, the bones are still there, buried beneath the dunes, the ivory, the vertebrae, and the teeth of creatures who once walked through a garden, never knowing that the sand was waiting just beyond the horizon. The engine of a modified Ford truck coughs against the heat, a solitary metallic sound in a landscape that has forgotten the meaning of noise. It is October of 1933, and the Hungarian explorer Laszlo Almásy is pushing deeper into the Gilf Kebir, a massive sandstone plateau that rises like a ghost fortress from the floor of the eastern Sahara. To the modern eye, this is the Great Sand Sea, a place of hyper-aridity where the moisture in a man's breath is reclaimed by the air before it even leaves his lips. Almásy is not looking for fossils or ancient riverbeds. He is chasing a legend, the mythical Oasis of Zerzura, said to be a city of white stone guarded by giants. But as he steers his vehicle through the jagged wadis of the remote southwest corner of Egypt, he finds something far more unsettling than a myth. He finds a mirror held up to a world that shouldn't exist. The discovery happens almost by accident, in a shallow rock shelter tucked away from the blistering glare of the noon sun. As Almásy steps into the shade of the overhang, his eyes take a moment to adjust to the dim, cool interior. The silence here is heavy, layered with the dust of millennia. And then he sees them. Painted in earthy reds and ochres upon the stone walls are figures that defy every law of the desert surrounding him. They are not hunters chasing gazelles, nor are they warriors locked in combat. They are swimmers. Almásy stands frozen, the heat of the desert still radiating from his clothes, as he stares at human forms with limbs outstretched, their bodies horizontal and fluid, frozen in the middle of a stroke. They appear to be gliding through an invisible medium, their torsos elongated, their legs kicking with a grace that can only be learned in the embrace of deep water. The shock of the find is visceral. To find a painting of a swimmer in the heart of the most desolate desert on earth is a paradox that borders on the hallucinatory. It is as if he had found a painting of a snowstorm in the middle of a volcano. At first, the mind tries to protect itself with logic. Perhaps these are symbolic gestures, Almásy might have thought, or perhaps they represent the souls of the dead drifting through the ether. But the more he looks, the more the reality of the scene settles into his bones. These are not floating spirits. The posture is too specific, the movement too rhythmic. These are people who knew the buoyancy of a lake. They knew the resistance of water against the palms of their hands and the way the light ripples across a submerged limb. As he traces the outlines with his eyes, the cave of swimmers begins to whisper a story that mainstream science at the time was not yet ready to hear. The realization begins to dawn on the expedition that they are not looking at a dream, but at a record. These paintings were a form of ancient stratigraphy, a word archaeologists use to describe the layering of history over time, but instead of being buried in the earth, the layers were spread across the cave walls. These figures were painted during the African Humid period, a time when the Earth's tilt shifted just enough to pull the monsoons northward, turning this wasteland into a tapestry of life. To the people who lived here 10,000 years ago, the idea of a desert would have been as foreign as the idea of a glacier. They lived in a world of permanent lakes, some as large as inland seas, where the hippopotamus wallowed in the shallows and the crocodile waited in the reeds. As the hours pass and the light shifts within the cave, the swimmers seem to move, animated by the flickering shadows of the afternoon. Almasi notes the presence of other animals nearby, giraffes and prehistoric cattle, creatures that require vast amounts of water and vegetation to survive. The evidence is undeniable, yet it feels impossible. The Gilf Kebir is currently one of the driest places on the planet, receiving perhaps a few millimeters of rain every decade. To stand in this dust and look at a painting of a man swimming is to feel the terrifying weight of deep time. It is a reminder that the earth is a living, breathing entity, and its lungs, the great forests and grasslands, can wither and vanish in what is, geologically speaking, the blink of an eye. The Cave of Swimmers was not merely an artistic expression, it was a testament to a lost reality. It proved that the Sahara was once the cradle of a civilization that preceded the pharaohs of the Nile by thousands of years. These people were the ancestors of the great African cultures, a nomadic and pastoral society that followed the rains and the rising waters. When the climate began to shift again, when the monsoons retreated and the lakes began to evaporate into salt flats, these people did not simply vanish, they moved. They carried their memories of the water with them, perhaps seeding the mythologies of later civilizations with stories of a lost garden or a great flood. Meanwhile, back in the 1930s, the world viewed the Sahara as a static, eternal barrier. The idea that it could have been a lush paradise within the span of human memory was considered radical, even heretical to some. But Almasi's discovery forced a confrontation with the limits of human knowledge. It suggested that our maps are only temporary, and our understanding of nature is often just a snapshot of a much longer, much more turbulent film. The swimmers on the wall were not myths, they were witnesses. They were a message left in a bottle of stone, waiting for thousands of years for someone to stumble into the shade and recognize the truth of their existence. And so, as the sun begins to dip towards the horizon and the desert air turns from a furnace to a chill, one can almost imagine the sound of splashing echoing in the wadis. If you sit long enough in the silence of the Gilf Kebir, the mind begins to play tricks. The whistling wind starts to sound like the rustle of papyrus reeds. The shimmering heat haze on the horizon looks like the surface of a vast blue lake. The sand, which flows like water when poured from a hand, is the only thing left of that world. It has filled the lakes, buried the forests, and smoothed over the graves of the swimmers. But here, in the dim light of the cave, the water still exists. It exists in the memory of the stone, and in the graceful, outstretched arms of the figures who, even after 10 millennia, refuse to sink into the dunes. Imagine for a moment the sound of 1,000 trickling streams, a soft, persistent chorus of moving water that once defined the silence of the high desert. To find the source of these ghosts, one must travel deep into the heart of the central Sahara, to a massive sandstone plateau known as the Tassili Najer. In the Tuareg language, this name translates to the plateau of the rivers, A title that seems almost like a cruel joke to the modern traveller standing amidst the scorched black pillars of rock and the endless, shifting seas of sand. Yet, as we climb higher into this labyrinth of stone, the landscape begins to reveal its true identity. This is not merely a desert, it is a fortress of memory, a geological library where the history of a lost world has been etched into the very skin of the earth. The plateau is a labyrinth of eroded sandstone, carved by ancient winds and vanished rains into a city of rock. There are natural arches that span wide canyons like frozen rainbows, and narrow corridors where the sun only reaches the floor for a few minutes at noon. It is here, within the shallow alcoves and deep rock shelters, that we find one of the most extensive collections of prehistoric art on the planet. There are more than 15,000 individual engravings and paintings scattered across these heights, a visual record that spans several thousand years of human experience. When we look at these images, we are not just looking at art, we are looking at the slow, agonizing transition of a landscape. We are watching the world turn brown. In the earliest layers of the rock, the images are dominated by the giants of the wild. These were the first artists of the Green Sahara, people who lived in a world of abundance where the rains were predictable and the grass grew tall enough to hide an elephant. They carved massive, life-sized figures into the dark patina of the sandstone, using stone tools to peck out the outlines of giraffes, hippopotamuses, and the extinct Bubalus antiquus, a giant buffalo with horns that could span 10 feet across. These engravings are fluid and confident, capturing the heavy grace of the animals with a precision that suggests a deep spiritual intimacy between the hunter and the hunted. The artists were not merely decorating their homes, they were acknowledging their place within a vast, living system. As the centuries drift by, a subtle shift begins to occur in the gallery of the Tassili. The wild giants begin to recede, replaced by a new protagonist, the cow. This period, often called the Bovidian stage, marks a profound change in how humans related to the earth. We see vast herds of long-horned cattle, their hides painted in delicate shades of red, white, and ochre. The figures of humans become more prominent, shown walking among their animals or sitting in front of domed huts that resemble the dwellings still used by nomadic herders in the Sahel today. The style becomes more painterly, more focused on the communal life of the tribe. We see scenes of dancing, of gathering, and of quiet moments between family members. To create these images, the artists looked to the earth itself. They gathered nodules of iron-rich hematite and limonite from the surrounding hills, grinding them into fine powders to create a spectrum of reds, yellows, and oranges. They used charcoal from their hearths for black and kaolin clay or bird droppings for white. These pigments were then mixed with a binding agent, perhaps milk or marrow, or the clear sap of an acacia tree, to create a paint that has, in many cases, survived for 7,000 years. There is a strange, quiet power in the thought of an artist or a shaman standing in these very spots, dipping a brush made of animal hair or a frayed stick into a pallet of groundstone, reaching out to touch the wall just as the light of a dying sun hit the canyon floor. The rock shelters were more than just shelters. They were communal cathedrals. They were places where the history of the people was kept alive through the act of painting. In many of the deeper alcoves, we find layers upon layers of images, where new paintings have been placed directly over older ones. This process of overpainting suggests that the act of creating the image was perhaps more important than the finished product itself. It was a ritual, a way of anchoring the community to a specific piece of ground in a world that was slowly becoming more unpredictable. As the rains began to fail and the lakes began to shrink, these shelters likely became even more significant, serving as spiritual refuges where the people could petition the spirits of the ancestors or the gods of the weather for a return to the green times. One can almost feel the cooling of the air as the shadows lengthen across the plateau. The sandstone, which absorbs the heat of the day, radiates a gentle warmth long after the sun has vanished. In the silence of the Tassili, the distance between the present and the prehistoric feels impossibly thin. We use terms like stratigraphy to describe the layers of soil and debris that have accumulated on the floors of these caves, and radiocarbon dating to pin these images to a specific point on a timeline. Radiocarbon dating is a method that measures the decay of carbon isotopes in organic material to tell us how long it has been since a plant or animal was alive. But these scientific tools, as vital as they are, struggle to capture the emotional weight of what we are seeing. We are seeing the birth of a nomadic identity, born out of the necessity of a drying world. As the great rivers of the plateau slowed to a trickle and then vanished into the sand, the people of the Tassili had to move. They followed the water, driving their cattle toward the shrinking oases in the distant highlands. The art reflects this movement, becoming more stylized, more portable in its themes. The transition from the wild animals of the deep past to the domesticated herds of the later periods is a visual map of human adaptation. It is a story of resilience, but also of loss. For every new technique discovered, for every new animal tamos, a piece of the old wild world was surrendered to the encroaching dunes. The silence of the plateau today is absolute, broken only by the occasional sigh of the wind through a stone arch. But if you sit quietly in one of these galleries and let your eyes adjust to the dim, filtered light, the stone begins to breathe. You see a hunter with a bow, his body tensed in a moment of eternal anticipation. You see a woman tending to a calf, her hand outstretched in a gesture of universal tenderness. You see the ripples of a river that hasn't flowed for 5,000 years, captured in a few strokes of red ochre. These are the voices of the Tassili, speaking to us across a gulf of time that is almost too vast to comprehend. They tell us that the Sahara was once a place of life, of color, and of song. And they remind us that the earth is never truly static, but a shifting, living thing that remembers everything we have forgotten. Imagine for a moment the sound of a potter's hands smoothing wet clay, a soft, rhythmic sliding of palms against the harvest of a riverbank. This sound, now long vanished, once echoed across a landscape that today knows only the scouring of grit and the silence of the dunes. The people who lived here 10,000 years ago did not see themselves as inhabitants of a desert, because the desert, as we know it, did not yet exist. They were the architects of a world in transition, moving through a long, slow morning of human history, where the boundaries between the wild and the settled were as fluid as the lakes they lived beside. As the dampness of the early Holocene, that epoch of warming that followed the last great ice age, began to transform North Africa, the wandering hunter-gatherers of the deep past began to slow their pace. They found themselves drawn to the permanent waters of the mega lakes, bodies of water so vast they created their own weather patterns. Here, the necessity of constant movement began to fade, replaced by the pull of the shoreline. This was the birth of the Saharan settlements, a series of scattered, vibrant communities that predated the pyramids of Egypt by thousands of years. We see the evidence of this shift in the very soil, layers of earth that reveal a steady progression from the spear to the sickle, and from the temporary camp to the enduring village. The transition was not a sudden revolution, but a patient unfolding. These early pastoralists, people who began to manage and live alongside semi-domesticated animals, were masters of a dual existence. They still hunted the great beasts depicted in the rock art, the giraffes and the elephants that roamed the savannah, but they also began to look toward the earth and the water with a new kind of intensity. In the archaeological record, we find thousands of tiny microlithic tools, delicate blades of stone, shaped with a precision that suggests a deep respect for the material. These were not just weapons, but the instruments of a complex daily life, scrapers for hides, borers for bone, and sickles for the tall, swaying stands of wild sorghum and millet that grew in the floodplains. Perhaps the most evocative remnants of this lost age are the shards of pottery. Long before the cradles of civilization in Mesopotamia or the Levant reached their peak, the inhabitants of the Green Sahara were already masters of the kiln. They created what archaeologists call wavy-line pottery, vessels decorated with undulating patterns that seemed to mimic the ripples of the water that sustained them. To hold a fragment of this ceramic today is to touch a ghost. It is a technology born of the need to store the abundance of the land. It tells us of a people who are no longer living hand to mouth, but who are planning for the seasons ahead, fermenting grains into porridges or perhaps early forms of ale and boiling the riches of the lake into nourishing stews. Their diet was a testament to the staggering biodiversity of a world we can now only see through satellite imagery and soil samples. They were a people of the water. Excavations at sites like Gobero in modern-day Niger have revealed mounds of fish bones, huge Nile perch that could weigh as much as a grown man, and the armor-like scales of crocodiles. They gathered freshwater mollusks by the thousands, leaving behind great middens of shells that act as time capsules for modern science. When we analyze the isotopes in their teeth, a process involving the study of chemical signatures left behind by the food they ate, we find a story of incredible health and variety. They ate the tubers of water lilies, the seeds of wild grasses, and eventually the milk and meat of the cattle that began to define their social status. As these communities grew, so too did the complexity of their social structures. They were not merely clusters of individuals, but organized societies with a shared sense of identity, and perhaps a shared sense of the sacred. We find evidence of this in the way they treated their dead. In the sprawling cemeteries of the Green Sahara, bodies are often found buried with great care, adorned with jewelry made of ostrich eggshells or beads carved from exotic stones. Some are buried in positions that suggest sleep, curled on their sides, hands tucked under their cheeks, facing toward a horizon that held a significance we can no longer name. There is a profound sense of order in these early settlements. The placement of hearths, the grouping of dwellings made of reeds and mud, and the communal areas for grinding grain all point to a world where everyone had a place. Was there a hierarchy? Were there elders who remembered the migrations of the old days, or shamans who interpreted the movements of the stars reflected in the still lakes? The archaeology suggests a degree of egalitarianism, yet the sheer scale of their pottery production and the distances over which they traded obsidian and greenstone imply a sophisticated network of exchange. They were connected to one another by more than just proximity. They were woven together by trade routes that spanned hundreds of miles, crossing a landscape that was easy to traverse before the sand took hold. We must wonder what they talked about as the shadows lengthened over the savannah. In a world without writing, their history was held in the breath of the storytellers. They would have known every bend in the river, every grove of acacia trees, and the specific temperament of the rains. They lived in a state of balance with a climate that was, though they could not have known it, precariously fragile. The African humid period, as researchers call this 10,000-year window of greenery, was a gift of orbital mechanics, a slight tilt in the Earth's axis that pulled the monsoons northward. To the people living in the settlements, this was simply the way the world was. They lived in an eternal present, surrounded by the lowing of cattle and the splashing of oars in the shallows. As we look back through the haze of 5 millennia of dust, these early Saharans appear not as primitive ancestors, but as a highly successful civilization that thrived in a garden that has since been locked away. They developed sophisticated tool-making techniques that would later influence the Nile Valley, and their experiments with cattle domestication would set the stage for the great pastoral cultures of the continent. They were the first to map this territory, not with ink on parchment, but with footprints and memories. And yet, for all their success, there is a haunting quality to their story. We see the remnants of their hearths now sitting in the middle of absolute desolation, where not a single blade of grass has grown for centuries. We find their grinding stones, heavy, smooth basins of granite, lying abandoned on the surface of the desert, as if the owners had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. It makes one reflect on the permanence of our own settlements, the cities we build with such confidence, assuming the rivers will always flow and the rains will always fall. The people of the Green Sahara lived in a world of plenty, a world of blue and green, never suspecting that the very air was slowly drying, and that the lakes which gave them life were destined to vanish into the heat, leaving only the salt and the memories behind. The change did not arrive with a thunderclap or a sudden searing heat, but rather with a silence that grew a little longer each year. It began approximately 5,000 years ago, a time when the Earth's slow wobbling tilt, a celestial rhythm known as precession, started to nudge the African monsoon slightly further south. It was a shift of only a few dozen miles at first, a distance so small that no single person could have measured it within their lifetime. Yet, in the delicate balance of the Sahara, these few miles were the difference between life and a slow, encroaching stillness. The rains, which had for millennia arrived with the reliability of the seasons, began to falter. Perhaps one summer the clouds gathered on the horizon, but never broke. Perhaps the next year they arrived late, their moisture spent before they could reach the deep interior of the basin. As the monsoon's reach faltered, the Great Lakes began their slow, agonizing retreat. If we could stand on the shores of Lake Megachad in those days, we would see a world in transition. The water's edge, once lapping against the roots of lush galleries of trees, began to pull back, leaving behind wide expanses of mud that baked into cracked, hexagonal patterns under the sun. The wetlands, those vibrant nurseries of life where hippos once wallowed and crocodiles drifted like fallen logs, began to fragment. What was once a continuous network of blue veins across the continent became a series of isolated pools separated by growing stretches of yellowing grass. The papyrus reeds began to brown at the edges, and the song of the frogs, once a deafening nightly chorus, grew thinner and more desperate as their ancestral homes shrank toward the center of the depressions. The water itself began to change, becoming a physical record of the land's distress. In archaeology, we look at stratigraphy, the study of the layers of the earth, to see this transformation. In the deeper layers, the sediment is rich and dark, filled with the remains of freshwater fish and delicate microorganisms that thrive in pure oxygenated water. But as we move upward into the layers from 5,000 years ago, the chemistry shifts. As the lakes evaporated and were not replenished by the rains, the minerals within them became concentrated. The water grew heavy, brackish, and increasingly saline. This increasing salinity, the saltiness of the water, acted as a slow poison for the life within. The Nile perch and the large catfish, which required vast, fresh territories to thrive, began to die off, their silver scales left to glint on drying mudflats that would never again be submerged. One can only wonder about the psychological weight this transformation placed upon the people who called this land home. To live through the drying of a world is to witness the slow erasure of everything you know to be true. For generations, the hunters and herders of the Green Sahara had moved through a landscape defined by abundance. They knew where the lilies bloomed and where the gazelles came to drink. Now, the landmarks were failing them. A spring that had served a clan for centuries might suddenly turn bitter. its water too salty for the cattle to drink. A lake that had once been an inland sea might become a shallow, stinking marsh, where the air was thick with the scent of decaying vegetation and salt. There must have been a profound sense of confusion, a feeling that the very spirits of the place were withdrawing. In the cave of swimmers, where the painted figures still moved through their imaginary depths, the actual water was miles away, sinking into the earth. The inhabitants would have watched the sky with an intensity we can hardly imagine, searching for a sign of the old world. They would have seen the dust beginning to rise, not the occasional dust of a summer storm, but a fine, persistent haze that began to coat the leaves of the acacia trees and settle in the folds of their clothing. The horizon, once sharp and clear, began to soften and blur as the topsoil, no longer anchored by the roots of lush grasses, was surrendered to the wind. As the years passed, the migrations became more frequent and more desperate. The people were forced into a nomadic existence that was less about following the rhythm of the seasons and more about a frantic search for the last remaining refuges. They clustered around the shrinking oases, their cattle competing for the thinning patches of green. We see this in the archaeological record through the changing styles of their pottery and the way their settlements became more temporary, more transient. The grand stone circles and the permanent villages near the lakes were abandoned to the encroaching dunes. There is a quiet tragedy in a hearth that is never lit again, in a grindstone left behind because it is too heavy to carry to a destination that may not even exist. The drying was a lesson in the fragility of the monumental. The inhabitants of the Green Sahara did not leave behind great pyramids or marble temples, yet their loss was no less total than the fall of any empire. They were a civilization defined by their relationship with the water, and as the water retreated, the very fabric of their society began to fray. The social bonds that had been forged in a land of plenty were tested by the scarcity of the new age. Perhaps there were conflicts over the last freshwater wells, or perhaps there was a collective, silent agreement to move toward the great river valleys, to the east and south, the Nile and the Niger, where the water still flowed, fed by distant mountains that the drought could not yet reach. It is a strange thought to consider that the great Nile civilizations, which we view as the very dawn of history, were in many ways a product of this environmental catastrophe. The people who fled the drying Sahara brought with them their knowledge, their cattle, and their myths, concentrating themselves in the narrow green ribbon of the Nile Valley. The desert was the forge that hammered the disparate tribes of the grasslands into a unified people, driven together by the necessity of survival. But back in the heart of the Sahara, the silence was becoming absolute. The great megalakes were now nothing more than white salt pans, shimmering with heat mirages that mimicked the water that had once been there. The wind became the primary architect of the landscape, carving the sandstone plateaus into strange, haunting shapes and piling the sand into dunes that marched across the plains like slow-motion waves. The memory of the green world began to fade into legend, passed down through stories told around fires in distant lands, tales of a time when the world was cool, when the mountains were draped in mist, and when men and women swam in the heart of what was now a wasteland of stone and sun. The cave of swimmers remained, hidden in the high reaches of the Gilf Kabir, its painted inhabitants frozen in their graceful strokes, moving through a sea of air, waiting for a rain that would not return for 10,000 years. We often think of the desert as an eternal thing, a landscape that has always been as it is. But the stratigraphy tells a different story. A story of a world that breathed, a world that was once vibrant and full of song. The transition from the Green Sahara to the Great Desert is a reminder of the deep time that governs our planet, a scale of time where the rise and fall of entire ecosystems is but a brief pulse in the long history of the Earth. As the last of the wetlands vanished and the salinity claimed the final pools, the Sahara became a place of ghosts, a vast repository of a lost world buried beneath the shifting sands, waiting for the wind or the curious hand of a traveler to reveal the secrets of the world before the sand. The sound of the wind is different when it carries only dust, lacking the damp weight of moisture and the rustle of leaves, as the African humid period began its slow, agonizing retreat into history. The rhythm of life across the Sahara underwent a profound and quiet transformation. Imagine a family standing upon the high plateaus of the Gilf Kabir or the craggy heights of the Tassili Nadja, looking out over a horizon that had, for thousands of years, been a tapestry of emerald and sapphire. For generations, these highlands were the crown jewels of the Green Sahara, catching the monsoon rains and cradling the headwaters of 1,000 small streams. But now, the rains are failing. The clouds that once gathered with the reliability of a heartbeat are becoming thin, frayed, and elusive. The deep time of the earth is shifting its gears, and the people living atop these stony fortresses are the first to feel the cooling of the world's breath. As the centuries slipped by, the high plateaus became islands of stone in an encroaching sea of heat. The springs that once bubbled from the sandstone began to falter, their voices reduced to a rhythmic drip before falling silent altogether. And so, a slow and heavy migration began. It was not a sudden flight of panic, but a measured, multi-generational descent. The communities who had painted the swimmers in the caves and carved the giraffes into the rock began to pack their belongings, their stone-grinding bowls, their woven baskets, and their precious obsidian tools, and turned their backs on the heights. They moved downward, following the gravity of survival, seeking the low-lying valleys and the deep depressions where the last remnants of the water table still clung to the earth. These valleys, known to us now as wadis, were the final arteries of a dying world. In these lower elevations, the groundwater was closer to the surface, and for a time life could still find a foothold. But this migration created a new and crowded reality. Where once the vastness of the Sahara allowed for a nomadic freedom that spanned hundreds of miles, the drying climate forced a concentration of populations. People who had once lived in isolated bands now found themselves sharing the same dwindling oases. The map of the human world was shrinking, folding in on itself like a drying leaf. The silence of the high plateaus was replaced by the lowing of cattle and the concentrated activity of thousands of people huddled around the last reliable waterholes. In this period of contraction, the relationship between humans and animals reached a new level of intensity. We see this clearly in the archaeological record through a process called stratigraphy, the study of the layers of earth and debris left behind over time. In the deeper, older layers, we find the remains of diverse wild game, but as we move up into the layers corresponding to the drying trend, the bones of domestic cattle begin to dominate the landscape. Cattle herding became more than just a way of life. It became a desperate survival strategy. These beasts were walking reservoirs of protein and fat, a mobile larder that could be moved from one patch of scrub brush to the next. The cattle period of Saharan rock art reflects this obsession. The walls of the shelters are no longer filled with the wild, leaping forms of antelopes or the aquatic grace of hippos, but with endless processions of cows, their horns curved like the crescent moon, their hides decorated with intricate patterns. The herders became the guardians of the last green places. They lived in a state of constant, watchful intimacy with their herds, perhaps even seeing their own survival mirrored in the health of their cattle. But as the waterholes continued to shrink, a new and darker shadow began to fall across the sand. When resources are infinite, peace is a natural state. But when the last well in 100 miles begins to turn to mud, the nature of human interaction changes. We begin to see the first evidence of organized conflict in the drying landscape. This was not the grand warfare of empires, but something more intimate and perhaps more tragic. Skirmishes over grazing rights, raids on a neighbor's herd, and the desperate defense of a family's only source of water. The archaeology of this transition reveals a shift in toolkits. Alongside the delicate fishhooks and harpoons of the wetter ages, we find an increase in projectile points, arrowheads made of flint and chert, crafted with a lethal precision. Some of the rock art from this era depicts scenes that are unsettling to the modern eye, figures with bows drawn, shields raised, and the unmistakable posture of combat. It is as if the drying earth was hardening the hearts of those who remained. The spirit of the cave of swimmers, with its sense of communal ease and abundance, was being replaced by a world of boundaries and vigils. The landscape was no longer a gift to be shared, but a prize to be held. Meanwhile, the very nature of the oases was changing. As the surrounding plains turned to dust, these pockets of green became hyper-concentrated ecosystems. The trees that remained, mostly hardy palms and acacias, were pruned and managed with careful intent. The soil around the waterholes was trodden down by thousands of hooves, becoming compacted and scarred. The people were learning the art of the desert, how to wait, how to conserve, and how to read the slightest change in the wind for the scent of distant moisture. They were becoming the first true desert dwellers, the ancestors of the Tuareg and the Berbers, forged in the kiln of 1,000-year drought. As the years passed, the distance between these oases grew. A journey that once took a day across a grassy savanna now took 3 days across a blistering wasteland. The connections between different groups began to sever. Cultures that had once shared pottery styles and linguistic roots became isolated, evolving in their own private pockets of the desert. This fragmentation is a hallmark of the end of the Green Sahara. The great cultural exchange that had characterized the Middle Holocene, that epoch of human history following the last ice age, was drawing to a close. The desert was winning, not through a sudden strike, but through the slow, relentless subtraction of life. There is a profound melancholy in the thought of these last communities clinging to the edges of drying lakes. They would have watched as the great mega-lakes, like Lake Mega Chad, which once covered an area larger than all the North American Great Lakes combined, slowly evaporated. They would have seen the shorelines recede by miles in a single lifetime, leaving behind vast salt flats that glittered like snow in the heat. They would have known, with a certainty that we can only imagine, that the world of their grandfathers was gone and would never return. The stories told around the fires in those dwindling oases must have been filled with the memory of water, of rivers that ran year-round, and forests so thick the sun could not reach the floor. Yet even in this retreat, there was a strange kind of beauty. The intensification of cattle herding led to the development of complex social structures and perhaps even the first inklings of hierarchy, as certain families controlled the best wells and the largest herds. This was the laboratory of human resilience. The lessons learned in the drying Sahara, the management of scarce resources, the breeding of hardy livestock, and the navigation of vast, featureless spaces would eventually be carried out of the desert and into the Nile Valley. As the Sahara became uninhabitable, the pressure of the sand pushed the survivors toward the great river to the east, setting the stage for one of the greatest flowerings of civilization the world has ever seen. But for those who remained until the very end, the experience was one of narrowing horizons. The high plateaus were now silent, their rock art fading under the relentless sun, the swimmers in the caves appearing to dive into a sea that had long since turned to air. The valleys were the final stage for the drama of the Green Sahara, a place where humanity made its last stand against the encroaching void. We are left to wonder about the prayers offered to the vanishing rain and the names of the last chiefs who led their people from the heights to the hollows, searching for a drop of water in a world that was turning, grain by grain, into the great sand sea. Imagine the sound of footsteps on stone echoing through a cooling canyon as the sun begins to retreat behind the high plateaus of the Gilf Kabir. Thousands of years ago, those footsteps did not belong to a lonely traveler or a modern explorer, but to an entire culture in motion. They were moving with a heavy, rhythmic pace, driven not by the desire to discover, but by the primal need to survive. As the monsoons failed and the grasses of the central Sahara withered into brittle golden husks, the horizon offered only one direction of hope. To the east, hidden behind the shimmering heat of the encroaching dunes, lay a ribbon of eternal blue. The drying of the Sahara was not a sudden catastrophe that happened in a single lifetime, but a slow, agonizing transformation that played out over generations. It was a long goodbye to a world of lakes and hippopotamuses, a gradual retreat that forced the scattered tribes of the interior toward the only reliable water source for thousands of miles. This was the Nile. At the time, the Nile was a wild, untamed thing, prone to massive, unpredictable flooding and surrounded by dense, swampy marshes. To the people of the high desert, it must have seemed both a salvation and a terrifying mystery. They brought with them more than just their cattle and their families. They carried the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 years of Saharan life. When we look at the earliest foundations of ancient Egypt, we often see them as a sudden flowering of culture, appearing almost out of nowhere along the riverbanks. But if we look closer, we find the fingerprints of the desert scattered throughout the first dynasties. The cattle cults that would eventually define Egyptian religion, the veneration of the bull and the cow goddess Hathor, did not begin in the mud of the Nile Delta. They began in the vast open pastures of the Nabta Playa, hundreds of miles to the west, where nomadic herders had been tracking the stars and honoring their livestock for millennia. The transfer of knowledge was profound. These migrants from the drying interior were masters of the sky. In the clear, dark nights of the desert, they had learned to read the heavens with a precision that was essential for their survival. They understood the cycles of the stars and how they coincided with the changing of the seasons. This astronomical expertise, developed in the deep Sahara, became the bedrock of Egyptian timekeeping and temple orientation. The Great Pyramids and the alignment of the Sphinx are not merely feats of engineering. They are the architectural echoes of a desert people who had spent thousands of years looking upward, mapping the celestial paths that would eventually guide the soul of a pharaoh to the afterlife. As these diverse groups converged upon the Nile Valley, a melting pot of ideas and traditions began to simmer. The agricultural techniques that had been practiced in the oases and around the seasonal lakes were adapted to the rich, silty soil left behind by the Nile's annual inundation. The pottery styles, the tools, and even the social hierarchies of the Green Sahara were transplanted into this new, fertile environment. It is as if the spirit of a lost world was being poured into a new vessel, one that was narrow and long, confined by the geography of the river. There is a certain irony in the way the desert, which had once been a lush paradise, became a harsh and unforgiving guardian. As the sands continued to pile up, creating the hyper-arid wasteland we recognize today, they formed a natural, impenetrable barrier. This wall of sand protected the burgeoning civilization along the Nile from outside invasion for centuries. While other cultures in the Near East were constantly rising and falling through conquest, the early Egyptians were left in relative peace to refine their art, their writing, and their complex social structures. The very desert that had driven them from their ancestral homes now stood as a silent sentinel, ensuring their survival. We might think of the Sahara as a void, a place where history goes to die, but for the early Egyptians it was the Red Land, a place of chaos and spirits that sat in perfect balance with the black land of the river valley. They never truly forgot where they came from. In their myths and their funerary rites, there are constant references to the western lands, the place where the sun sets and where the ancestors dwell. To die was to go west, a poetic return to the ancestral plains that had once been green and full of life. Archaeologists working in the deep desert often find strange anomalies, stone circles and megaliths that predate the pyramids by thousands of years. These sites, like Nabta Playa, utilize a complex understanding of the summer solstice, suggesting that the intellectual seeds of Egypt were sown in the sand long before the first stone was laid at Saqqara. This was a sophisticated society that understood the rhythms of the earth and the cosmos, a people who had mastered the art of living in harmony with a changing climate until the change became too great to bear. As the centuries stretched into millennia, the memory of the Green Sahara faded into legend. The stories of the Great Lakes and the swimming men became whispers, perhaps transforming into the tales of a primordial mound rising from the waters of creation. But the evidence remains, buried beneath hundreds of feet of shifting sand. Every so often, a windstorm will peel back a layer of the desert to reveal a fossilized stump of a tree, or the bleached bones of a crocodile in a place where no water has flowed for 5,000 years. Looking at the map of the ancient world, we see the Nile as a single thread of life in a vast empty space. But if we could peel back time, we would see that this thread was once a vibrant tapestry that covered the entire northern half of the continent. The people who fled the encroaching dunes were not just refugees. They were the architects of a new way of being. They took the freedom of the open plains and channeled it into the discipline of the river. They took the mystery of the deep desert and turned it into the majesty of the monuments. One cannot help but wonder what was lost in that transition, what songs were forgotten because they only made sense when sung across a grassy savannah, what gods were left behind in the caves of the Gilf Kebir, their images slowly eroding in the wind. The transition to the Nile was a trade of vast horizons for the security of a permanent river. It was the birth of a civilization that would last for 3,000 years, but it was also the end of a way of life that had endured for much longer. Even today, the wind that blows off the Sahara carries a fine red dust that settles on the temples of Luxor and the streets of Cairo. It is a constant reminder of the world that came before, a world where the desert was a garden and the people were as fluid and adaptable as the water they sought. The legacy of the Nile is, in many ways, the legacy of the Sahara. The two are inseparable, bound together by a history of climate and migration that we are only just beginning to piece together. As we sit in the quiet of the modern age, the scale of this shift is difficult to comprehend. We speak of centuries, but the Green Sahara existed on the scale of deep time, a period of 10,000 years where the earth breathed differently. The transition to the river was a pivotal moment in the human story, a moment where we stopped wandering and started building for eternity. And yet, the desert remains, a silent witness to everything that was lost and everything that was gained. It is a landscape of ghosts, where the echoes of 1,000 forgotten winters still linger in the hollows of the rocks, waiting for the rains that may never come again. The sand continues its slow, patient march, covering the tracks of those who walked toward the river so long ago. But the knowledge they carried, the understanding of the stars, the reverence for life, and the ability to find beauty in a changing world lives on in the stones they left behind. The Nile was not just a river, it was a sanctuary, a final refuge for a culture that had nowhere else to go, and in that refuge they built a world that would never be forgotten. The transformation of a world does not always happen with a roar. Sometimes it occurs with the soft, rhythmic sifting of 1 billion individual grains of glass. As the monsoon rains failed and the great African humid period drew to a close, A heavy, suffocating silence began to settle over the plains. The vibrant green carpet of the Sahara did not vanish overnight, but rather it frayed at the edges, the grasses turning to brittle straw, the lakes shrinking into salty pans, and the forests retreating into the deep shadows of the mountain valleys. What remained was a landscape in transition, a fragile kingdom caught between the memory of water and the inevitability of the void. The winds, once cooled by the evaporation of vast inland seas, grew hot and restless. They began to pick up the dried silt of the lake beds, the fine powdery remains of millions of years of life. This was the beginning of the Great Dust Bowl, a planetary-scale event that saw the very soil of the Green Sahara lifted into the atmosphere. Scientists call this process aeolian erosion, where the wind becomes the primary architect of the land, stripping away the fertile earth and revealing the skeleton of the continent beneath. As the vegetation died, there was nothing left to hold the ground in place. The roots that had once anchored the soil withered, and the earth simply took flight. Huge plumes of dust, thousands of miles long, began to drift across the Atlantic, fertilizing distant rainforests with the minerals of a dying world. A strange poetic exchange where the end of one ecosystem provided the nutrients for another. But for those who remained in the heart of the desert, the experience was one of slow, inevitable burial. The sand dunes, those wandering giants of the waste, began their long march across the horizon. They moved with a patient, terrifying grace, cresting over the abandoned villages of the cattle herders and the riverside camps of the fishermen. We often think of the desert as an empty space, a void of nothingness. But in reality, it is a vast golden shroud. Beneath the swaying curves of the great sand sea and the shifting slopes of the Ténéré, an entire world lies perfectly preserved. There are stone circles, hearths containing the charcoal of the last fires ever lit, and the bones of hippopotamuses and crocodiles that were caught in the receding tide of history. The scale of this preservation is difficult to fathom. In some regions, the sand is hundreds of feet deep, acting as a natural sarcophagus for a civilization we are only just beginning to map. Using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, we can peer through the orange veil to see the ghost lines of ancient river systems, the paleo channels that once carried life-giving water across 1,000 miles of territory. These are not merely dry beds, they are time capsules. Because the desert is so arid, the normal processes of decay are arrested. Organic materials that would have rotted away in a damp forest are instead desiccated and kept in a state of suspended animation. Somewhere deep beneath the dunes of the empty quarter or the wind-swept plateaus of Libya, there are wooden tools, woven baskets, and perhaps even the remains of structures that have not seen the sun in 5,000 years. As the sand rose, it fossilized the aquatic history of the Sahara in a way that feels almost surreal. In the middle of the most desolate stretches of the Ténéré, where the heat can melt the soles of a traveler's boots, explorers have found the white, bleached vertebrae of whales and the teeth of gargantuan sharks. These belong to an even deeper time, of course, the ancient Tethys Sea. But layered above them are the more recent ghosts of the Green Sahara. There are places where the ground is literally paved with the shells of freshwater snails and the delicate, needle-like bones of catfish. To walk across these plains is to walk upon the floor of a vanished ocean, a place where the air should be thick with the smell of salt and reeds, but is instead filled only with the scent of dry stone and the sound of the wind. The silence that reclaimed the land was not the silence of a beginning, but the heavy, weighted silence of an ending. In the Ténéré, a region often called a bosso, a desert within a desert, the stillness is absolute. This was once a crossroads of human activity, a place of music, trade, and the lowing of vast herds of long-horned cattle. Now, the only sound is the singing of the dunes, a low, haunting hum, caused by the friction of sand grains sliding against one another. It is a mournful sound, a vibration that resonates in the chest, as if the earth itself is humming a dirge for the world it lost. The herders who once lived here, the people who carved the beautiful giraffes of Dabus and painted the swimmers of the Gilf Kebir, were forced to retreat to the fringes, to the Nile, to the highlands of Ethiopia, or to the shrinking oases that offered a temporary reprieve from the encroaching heat. We must wonder what it felt like to be the last generation to remember the water, to be the child who heard stories from their grandfather about a lake that once stretched to the horizon, a lake that was now nothing more than a patch of cracked mud and white salt. There is a profound melancholy in the stratigraphy of these sites, the layers of earth that tell the story of a drying world. In the lower levels we find the lush evidence of a garden, fish hooks, harpoons made of bone, and the pollen of ferns and trees. But as we move upward through the soil, these signs begin to vanish. The fish hooks are replaced by arrowheads for hunting desert gazelles, and the tree pollen gives way to the hardy seeds of scrub brush. Finally, there is only the sand, clean, sterile, and indifferent. The empty quarter, the Rub al-Khali of the Arabian Peninsula, underwent a similar transformation. It is one of the most inhospitable places on earth today, yet it too was once a land of lakes and meadows. The buried cities of Arabian legend, like the fabled Ubar, are often dismissed as myths, but the archaeology of the Green Sahara suggests that the truth may be even more remarkable. The desert does not just destroy, it hides. It keeps secrets better than any jungle or ocean. When the sand moves, it occasionally reveals a glimpse of what lies beneath, a flint blade resting on a pedestal of wind-eroded rock, or a cluster of grinding stones used to process grain that hasn't grown in the region for millennia. These artifacts are deflated, left sitting on the surface as the lighter soil around them was blown away, tiny monuments to a life that the sand could not quite erase. As the years passed and the Sahara reached its modern state of hyper-aridity, the memory of the green world faded into the realm of folklore and myth. The cave of swimmers became a localized curiosity, its meaning lost to the people who wandered past it. The great river systems became wadis, dry canyons that only roar with water for a few hours every few decades after a rare, violent storm. The world became a place of extremes, where the sun rules the day and the cold claims the night, and where the presence of water is felt more in its absence than in its reality. And yet, the Green Sahara is not truly gone. It is merely sleeping. The cycles of the earth's tilt, the procession of the equinoxes that once brought the rains, continue their slow celestial dance. In another 10,000 years, the winds may shift again, the monsoons may return to the north, and the seeds that have lain dormant in the parched earth for eons may finally feel the touch of moisture once more. But for now, we are the observers of the long winter, the guardians of a history that was nearly swallowed by the dunes. We look at the rock art and the buried riverbeds, and we realize that our own world is just as subject to the whims of the planet. The sand is patient, and the earth has a long memory, and beneath the silence of the Ténéré, the heart of a lost world still beats, waiting for the clouds to return. A single drop of water, if it were to fall today in the heart of the Merzuk desert, would likely vanish before it even touched the burning grains of quartz. And yet, if we could see with eyes that perceive the invisible, we would realize that we are standing above a ghost. Modern technology has granted us a form of second sight, a way to peer through the golden shroud of the dunes using synthetic aperture radar. From the cold silence of orbit, satellites have looked down upon the great sand sea and seen something that defies the modern eye. Beneath the shifting crests of the Sahara, the earth holds the skeletal remains of a vast, interconnected nervous system. These are the paleo-drainage systems, the ghost rivers that once roared with life. These ancient riverbeds, some as wide as the Nile, stretch for hundreds of miles beneath the suffocating weight of the sand, preserved in a state of geological amber. When the radar penetrates the dry surface, it reveals the winding curves of the Tamanrasset River, a gargantuan waterway that once flowed from the Atlas Mountains all the way to the Atlantic coast. It is a haunting thought that as we trek across a landscape defined by thirst, we are often walking directly above the dry bones of a river that once supported hippopotamuses, crocodiles, and sprawling human settlements. The earth does not forget where its water used to run. As we study these subterranean maps, we find that the Sahara is not merely a wasteland, but a vessel. Deep within the earth, far below the reach of the sun's heat, lies the Nubian sandstone aquifer system. It is the largest fossil water reservoir in the entire world, spanning more than 2 million square kilometers across 4 different nations. This is water that fell as rain 10,000 years ago. Moisture that was absorbed by the soil when the cave of swimmers was a place of living joy rather than a dusty memory. This water is ancient, pristine and finite. It is a liquid legacy of the Green Sahara, trapped in the pores of the rock like a secret whispered in a tomb. To touch this water today is to touch the very same rain that once nourished the lush savannas of the Holocene. It is a strange paradox to realize that one of the driest places on our planet sits atop a sea of fresh water so vast it could submerge the entire United States under several feet of blue. We are learning that the desert is a master of preservation, keeping its treasures hidden in the deep dark, far from the reach of the wind. But the Sahara's influence reaches far beyond its own invisible borders. It is not an isolated scar on the face of the planet, but a vital organ in the body of the world's climate. Every year, the fierce winds of the Harmattan sweep across the Baudelaire Depression, lifting millions of tons of dust high into the atmosphere. This dust, rich with the nutrients of dried-up ancient lake beds and the pulverized shells of prehistoric organisms, embarks on a journey across the Atlantic Ocean. It is a beautiful, invisible bridge of minerals. This Saharan dust eventually falls over the Amazon rainforest, providing the essential phosphorus that the lush jungle needs to thrive. The greatest forest on earth owes its survival to the greatest desert on earth. In the grand tapestry of deep time, the death of the Green Sahara provided the lifeblood for the South American tropics. This interconnectedness reminds us that the desert is not a void. It is a lung, exhaling the dust of the past to nourish the breath of the present. As we contemplate these global cycles, we must confront the reality that the Sahara is not a permanent fixture, but a phase. Geologists and climatologists have begun to decode a rhythmic pulse in the Earth's history, a cycle of greening and browning that has repeated itself dozens of times over the last several million years. This cycle is driven by the Milankovitch cycles, subtle wobbles in the Earth's tilt and orbit that change how the sun's energy hits the northern hemisphere. Every 20,000 years or so, the tilt of our planet shifts just enough to pull the African monsoon further north. When this happens, the rains return. The dust settles, the seeds that have waited in the parched earth for millennia finally crack open, and the rivers begin to hum once more. The sand is not the end of the story. It is merely a long intermission. The Sahara. We know today this vast expanse of silence and heat is approximately 5,000 years into its current dry phase. If the patterns of the past hold true, the cycle will eventually turn again. In another 10,000 to 12,000 years, the ghost rivers may find their voices. The Nubian aquifer may be replenished by the sky instead of being tapped by the hand of man. The cave of swimmers might once again overlook a lake where children splash in the cooling waters, unaware that for thousands of years their world was a kingdom of dust. We live in the brief, flickering moment of the brown Sahara. We see the dunes as eternal, but to the earth they are as fleeting as the morning mist. The desert is a sleeping giant, dreaming of the rain. It is a humbling exercise to imagine the future travelers of that green world, stumbling upon the ruins of our own era, buried beneath the sediment of new forests. Will they understand the weight of the sand that once covered their homes? Will they find our satellites and our sensors and wonder how we survived in such a formidable wilderness? The stratigraphy, the layers of rock and soil that record the passing of ages, will show a thin, dark line of desert between two vast expanses of green. They will see the evidence of the long winter we are currently inhabiting. And perhaps they will look at the rock art of the Gilf Kabir with a different kind of awe, not as a record of a lost world, but as a prophecy of their own. As the years pass and our understanding of the planet deepens, we realize that we are guardians of a very fragile history. The Sahara teaches us that nothing is truly lost, only hidden. The rivers are still there. They are simply waiting. The lakes are still there. They are simply dry. The life that once teemed across these plains has retreated to the edges, to the oases and the highlands, waiting for the celestial clock to strike the hour of the monsoon. There is a profound peace in this realization. The desert is not a place of death, but a place of profound patience. It is a library of the earth's memory, where every grain of sand is a word, and every dune is a page, waiting for the wind to turn it over and reveal the verdant chapters yet to come. We look out over the horizon, where the heat haze blurs the line between the earth and the sky, and we feel the weight of these forgotten ages. The Sahara is a mirror, reflecting our own vulnerability and the immense, slow power of the natural world. It tells us that the climate is a restless thing, a shifting set of boundaries that we often mistake for permanent borders. But the earth has a much longer memory than we do. It remembers the hippos in the Tenere. It remembers the sound of the Tamanrasset River rushing toward the sea. And it knows, with the certainty of the stars, that the green will return. Until then, we listen to the echoes from the deep sand, the whispers of a world before sand, and a world that will eventually rise from beneath it. The silence of the desert is not an absence of sound, but a presence of history. It is the sound of time itself, flowing as slowly as a river of quartz, carrying us toward a future where the dunes are gone and the water is king once more. Moving through this landscape, we are merely ghosts in a garden that is currently resting, waiting for the first drop of rain to wake it from its long golden sleep. The weight of 10,000 years is a heavy burden for a landscape to carry, yet the Sahara wears its history with a quiet, indifferent grace. We often think of the earth as a fixed stage, a solid foundation upon which the fleeting dramas of humanity are performed, but the cave of swimmers whispers a different truth, a truth of profound and rhythmic impermanence. To look upon those painted figures, suspended in their eternal mid-stroke across a ceiling of stone, is to realize that even the most vast and intimidating environments on our planet are subject to the whims of the stars and the tilt of the Earth's axis. The great desert, which today seems like an eternal ocean of fire and grit, is merely a passing season in the deep time of the African continent. It is a reminder that the world we know is not the world that has always been, nor is it the world that will always be. The sand is not a beginning or an end, but a veil, a golden shroud that preserves the memory of a wetter, greener reality until the cycle begins anew. There is a strange comfort in this realization, a sense of belonging to a process that is far larger than our individual lives or even our entire civilization. The resilience of life is perhaps the most striking lesson of the Green Sahara. When the monsoons failed and the lakes began to shrink into salty pools, life did not simply vanish. It adapted, it migrated, and it waited. The elephants and giraffes retreated to the south, the hippopotami followed the receding riverbeds, and the humans, the artists who once dove into cool, clear waters, moved toward the Nile or retreated into the high plateaus where the last remnants of moisture clung to the rocks. Life is a stubborn flame, and even when the landscape becomes a furnace, it finds the cracks and shadows where it can endure. The Cave of Swimmers is a message sent across 10 millennia, a testament to a time when humanity lived in a state of abundance that we can scarcely imagine today, and yet it also speaks to our ability to survive the loss of that abundance. As the years passed and the grass gave way to scrub, and the scrub gave way to the encroaching dunes, the memory of the water stayed with the people. It lived on in their stories, in their myths of a lost paradise, and in the very rock art that we now study with such curiosity. We look at these paintings through the lens of archaeology and stratigraphy, a word that simply means the study of the layers of earth and time, but the people who painted them were not recording history. They were celebrating the present. They were painting the world as it was, never suspecting that the very element that sustained them, the water, would one day be the rarest treasure in the world. The desert, in its current state, is not a wasteland, but a repository of memory. Every grain of sand is a tiny fragment of a mountain that once stood tall. Every dry wadi is a ghost of a river that once sang through the valley. The silence of the Gilf Kabir is a saturated silence, heavy with the echoes of cattle lowing and children splashing in the shallows. We often find ourselves searching for permanence in a universe defined by change. We build monuments of stone and steel, hoping to leave a mark that will last forever. Yet the Sahara shows us that even the earth itself is fluid. The process of desertification, driven by the subtle shifts in the Earth's orbit and the gradual cooling of the northern hemisphere, transformed a garden into a furnace in a span of time that is but a heartbeat in the geological record. And yet, the paintings remain. The pigment, ground from the earth itself, has clung to the stone through thousands of years of heat and wind. It is a fragile kind of permanence, a delicate bridge between the humid past and the arid present. It suggests that while landscapes may shift and climates may fail, the human impulse to witness and record the beauty of our surroundings is one of the few constants in an ever-changing world. The beauty of the desert lies in this duality, the tension between the harshness of the surface and the richness of what lies beneath. To walk across the dunes is to walk over the rooftops of a forgotten world. Beneath the feet of a modern traveller lie the hearths of ancient camps, the bones of prehistoric fish and the tools of hunters who saw the world in shades of emerald and sapphire. The desert does not destroy, it hides. It keeps its secrets under a blanket of heat and wind, waiting for the curious or the lucky to stumble upon a cave or a canyon that holds a fragment of the truth. The Cave of Swimmers is one such fragment, a window into a reality that seems like a dream to us now, a dream of water in a land of thirst. As we contemplate the vast stretches of time that separate us from those ancient swimmers, the boundaries between the past and the present begin to blur. We are part of the same story, the same rhythmic breathing of the planet. Just as the Sahara was once green, it will be green again. The cycle of the Earth's tilt, the procession of the equinoxes, continues its slow and steady dance, and in several thousand years the monsoons will return. The dust will be washed away, The dry lake beds will fill with rainwater, and the seeds that have lain dormant in the parched earth for millennia will finally crack open and reach for the sun. The desert is not a permanent state, but a long, indrawn breath. In the quiet of the night, under a canopy of stars that have watched over the Sahara since long before the first human picked up a piece of ochre, the landscape feels alive with this potential. The dunes seem to shift not just with the wind, but with the weight of the memories they carry. We are reminded that we are temporary guests on a world that is constantly reinventing itself. The Cave of Swimmers teaches us to look at the world with a sense of wonder and humility, to recognize that the ground beneath our feet has seen many lives and many forms. It encourages us to appreciate the current moment, while also acknowledging the deep, slow currents of change that move beneath the surface of our perception. Perhaps the true message of the Cave of Swimmers is not about the past at all, but about the nature of survival. It is a meditation on how we carry our world with us, even when that world is disappearing. The artists did not paint the desert, they painted the water. They held on to the image of the life they loved, even as the environment around them began to harden and dry. They left us a map of their hearts, a record of what they valued most. And in doing so, they ensured that the Green Sahara would never truly die. It would live on in the minds of anyone who stands in that cave and feels the cool phantom of a lake that vanished 5,000 years ago. The desert is a teacher of patience. It moves at a pace that defies our modern obsession with speed and progress. It reminds us that time is not a line but a circle, a series of seasons on a scale so grand that we can barely perceive the curve. The swimmers on the wall are not just relics of a lost civilization. They are symbols of the human spirit's ability to find joy and movement in any environment. They remind us that even in the heart of the most desolate place on earth, there was once laughter and splashing water and the simple pleasure of a summer day. As we move toward the final chapter of this journey, we carry these images with us. The swimmers, the giraffes, the cattle, and the green hills that now exist only in the mind's eye. We understand now that the Sahara is not a barrier, but a bridge. A connection to a deeper understanding of our planet's history and our own place within it. The sand is beautiful, yes, but its beauty is heightened by the knowledge of what it conceals. It is the beauty of a mask, or a closed book, or a sleeping giant. And as we rest in the stillness of the desert night, we can almost hear the faint, rhythmic sound of 1,000 people swimming, a sound that carries across the millennia, reminding us that nothing is ever truly lost, so long as it is remembered. The desert night is not a vacuum, but a presence, a cold velvet weight that settles upon the dunes as the heat of the day radiates back into the infinite blackness above. Looking up, the stars do not merely twinkle, they blaze with a steady, piercing clarity that only the driest air on earth can provide. Each pinpoint of light is a ghost of a sun from a distance so vast that the mind struggles to hold the concept, mirroring the ghosts that rest beneath the very sand where we stand. The Milky Way stretches across the sky like a river of silver mist, a celestial reflection of the ancient watercourses that once carved through this land, carrying the lifeblood of a green world toward the sea. In this profound stillness, the Sahara seems to breathe. It is a slow, rhythmic respiration that spans thousands of years, a long, patient inhalation of dust and heat that marks the current epoch of the Earth's great cycle. We often think of the desert as a finished thing, a final destination of decay. But in the context of deep time, this arid phase is merely a season. It is the long sleep of the sands. Beneath the cooling crust of the earth, the aquifers remain, cradling the remnants of the rains that fell when the first potters were shaping clay on the banks of Lake Megachad. The water is still there, hidden in the dark pores of the stone, waiting for the tilt of the planet's axis to shift once more, waiting for the monsoons to return and wake the sleeping seeds that have survived for millennia in the parched soil. The desert is not dead. It is simply dreaming of the rain. And as it dreams, it guards the secrets of those who came before, the cattle herders, the hunters, and the artists who saw a world of abundance, where we now see a wasteland of stone, high on the plateau of the Gilf Kabir, within the sheltered curve of the Cave of Swimmers. The figures on the wall remain suspended in their eternal dance. They do not age and they do not tire. They continue their graceful horizontal glide through a medium that has long since vanished into the air. As the temperature drops and the silent wind whispers against the rock face, one can almost imagine the stone softening, turning back into the cool, life-giving water it once overlooked. We offer a final, silent farewell to these ancestors, these people who lived through the transition of a world and left behind a message of movement and joy. They remind us that the human spirit is defined not by the permanence of its surroundings, but by its ability to find beauty and connection in the fleeting moment, whether that moment lasts a single afternoon or 10,000 years. The history of the Green Sahara teaches us that the earth is a living, shifting entity, far more dynamic than our brief lifespans allow us to easily perceive. We occupy only a thin sliver of the stratigraphy, the layers of soil and rock that record the passing of ages. Below us lie the shells of freshwater snails and the bones of hippopotami, and above us is the vast, uncaring clockwork of the cosmos. Between the two, we find our own story, written in ochre and charcoal on the walls of a cave. It is a story of adaptation and resilience, a testament to the fact that even when the lakes dry up and the grass turns to dust, the memory of the water remains. The narration begins to fade now, retreating like the ancient shoreline of a receding lake. The voices of the past grow quiet, tucked away beneath the protective blanket of the dunes. There is no more need for words, for the desert speaks best in its own language of silence and starlight. The air is perfectly still. The cold is a gentle reminder of the vastness of the space around you. As you drift toward your own rest, imagine the sand shifting ever so slightly in the breeze, a soft hushing sound that smooths over the footprints of the day. The swimmers are at peace in their stone sea. The earth is breathing slowly, deeply, in its long arid slumber. Everything is as it should be. The cycle continues. The stars watch over the sands, and the sands watch over the secrets of the green world, waiting for the turn of the wheel. The shadows in the cave deepen, blending the painted figures into the natural textures of the rock until they are one and the same. The history of the world is a long book, and we have only turned a single page tonight. There are many more chapters hidden in the dust, many more civilizations waiting for their turn to be remembered. But for now, the book is closed. The light is extinguished. There is only the cool night air, the infinite sky, and the profound healing quiet of the deep desert. Let the weight of the ages settle over you, like the fine golden silt of an ancient riverbed. You are part of this continuity, a single heartbeat in the long life of the planet. There is nothing to fear in the passage of time, for as the Cave of Swimmers shows us, nothing is ever truly lost. It merely changes form. It waits. It rests. And so do we. The silence expands, filling the room, filling the mind, until there is only the rhythmic pulse of the universe. Steady, slow, and eternal. Sleep now as the desert sleeps, beneath the silver river of the stars, in the cradle of the ancient sands, where the water once flowed and will flow again.